Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome. This is your latest edition of FreeThought Hour, and it's following Global Atheist News, in case you've just come from watching that. If you haven't, please try and catch it next week. That's the show that starts at 8 o'clock on our UK time, and at the top of the hour, wherever you are, wherever you're watching from. So, tonight, I have a fantastic guest. He's a retired medical writer. He's born in New York. He's undergone a journey to try and find faith, and he's currently resident in Philadelphia. He's written a book about his experiences. So, please welcome Steve Tiger. Hello, Steve.
Hi, John.
How are you?
I'm good, and I'm glad to be here on this program with you.
Great. Yeah, I'm pleased to have you. Now, we've had a little chat beforehand, haven't we? And a couple of weeks ago when we first met. So we do know a little bit about each other, but our audience doesn't. So please, will you tell them a bit about your early days, how you were raised, how you got to be the Steve Tiger you are at the moment. And that's an interesting name too, isn't it? A tiger.
Oh, that's my real name. Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to hear about that. So you start telling us, and I'll put you full screen. And then if I've got something that I want to pick up on, I'll bring myself back and we'll have some to and fro.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Right. Off you go.
All right. I am, as you said, John, a retired medical writer. I spent 33 years writing scientific reviews and reports for medical journals and medical conferences. And I think that was a useful experience for me, as it turns out, when I was approaching writing a book about religion. And when you asked me, John, about how did I become the person I am today, well, I think I'll have to limit that to how did I become the person whose orientation towards religion is what it is today.
Okay. That sounds fine.
I was raised in New York City in an entirely secular manner. I had no religious upbringing at all. I wasn't inculcated with any attitudes, positive or negative, about religion. I had some curiosity about it, but it was simply not really of much importance to me. When I was a young man, however, much younger than I am now, I'm 76, I had reached a point in my life in which I thought I wanted certainty. I was tired, frankly tired of having to think and wonder and never have any assurance, well, yes, this is true. And so I began looking into the possibility that there was more to the universe than the physical environment that I could sense, and that I could that I could interpret rationally.
Can I just interrupt a little bit there?
Sure.
Because I've just been having a debate on, well, not really a debate. I put a thread. I put up an original post on a Facebook group that I haunt. It's populated by a mixture of theists and atheists. So you get some interesting exchanges of views on there. And you mentioned that you were looking for certainty.
Yes.
And that's what my post was about. I said that believers seem to have an extreme desire for certainty. And
of
course,
absolutely. One of the things that I noted during the 3 years that I spent visiting a variety of Christian churches was that the people who were attending the churches seemed to have the certainty that I didn't have, but wanted, or at least thought I wanted.
Mm.
And so I was really eager to find faith.
Yes.
And I kept at it for 3 years.
Yes.
Sometimes I would visit a church just for a week or two. Sometimes I stayed for the better part of a year at certain churches.
And you saw all these self-assured people who seemed to have answers to everything, and you were jealous.
They either had answers or they had at least a sense of assurance that if they didn't have the answer themselves, it was nothing to worry about because everything was in God's hands.
Yes.
So there were two other things that happened that drew me towards Christianity in particular, as the site from which I was trying to find certainty. One was I had been listening to classical music for most of my life. Other than my very early years when I grew up with rock and roll, I listened mainly to classical music, and there were certain pieces that were so magnificent that it seemed to me that this cannot be explained simply in terms of the composer's technical training as musicians.
Right.
And I couldn't explain it, and I still can't. The other was that I had become a little familiar with at least some of the teachings associated with Jesus. And I said, okay, well, now that's intriguing. And so I began looking in Christian churches for the kind of faith, the certainty that I was seeking at that time.
You didn't try any of the synagogues in New York?
No, at the time that I'm describing right now, actually, I was living in California.
Oh, I see.
In a relatively small town in California. And so mostly there were Christian churches, and so that's where I was. That's where I visited.
Yes. Different flavors of Protestantism.
For the most part, yes. A couple of less typical, not mainstream Protestant experiences also, but that was the main. That was the main source. So, how can I summarize the 3 years that I spent there? I was really trying to be part of the church community, to be part of it, to be active, took part in adult Bible classes, spoke to the pastors at these churches, asked questions.
Yeah.
And bottom line was, I never found the faith, the certainty that I was looking for.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons, the main reason, was that the doctrines that I was learning about, specifically about sin and salvation, from day one, I found that they were intrinsically self-contradictory. I just zeroed in on that immediately. And, earlier I said that having been a professional medical writer for all those years, and I had been doing this for several years at this time.
So you knew something about critical thinking, and
that's the point exactly. That's exactly the point. Was that I was used to questioning, does this make sense? Because as a professional medical writer, I could not produce a report that would leave readers questioning.
No.
Is this true? Is this real? So I had to question. I couldn't avoid questioning.
Yes.
And in questioning, I said, well, no, there's something that's intrinsically self-contradictory here. But
Can
I
I?
didn't give up. I tried to stay with it. I was writing notes to myself and
Oh yeah.
trying to
Yes.
figure things out, trying to resolve what looked like
Yes.
the self contradictions.
Can I inspect that? What particular aspects of sin and salvation did you find contradictory?
I would say well. First of all, let me mention that
Yeah, sure.
the notes that I took at the time uh, eventually became the core of the book that I wrote, Doctrine Impossible,
I'll
much
put that
much
up.
later.
Let
But
me put that up so
yeah,
people can see.
the first things that occurred to me was that sin was I was taught entered the world through the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the garden,
Yes, the original sin.
the original sin. Yes, and what occurred to me was that if God created them, He either created them perfect or imperfect.
Yep.
If He created them perfect, they would have behaved perfectly because it's absurd to say that perfect beings would voluntarily choose to act imperfectly. That's absurd.
Yes.
On the other hand, if they were created imperfect, then sooner or later they were going to act imperfectly
Yeah.
because it is also absurd to think that imperfect beings could act perfectly throughout the entirety of their lives.
Hmm.
So, the first occasion when they had to show their stuff, as it were, God gives them the command, don't eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Hmm.
They acted imperfectly. Now, they had never had any prior experience with accepting instructions, prohibitory instructions.
No.
They had no experience with that. So if
No.
they were ever going to act imperfectly, this first occasion was probably the most likely time that it was going to happen.
And it was going to be entirely innocent, wasn't it? Because, as you said, they didn't know t'other from which at that stage.
Well, I raised that point also, and many atheists have raised the point that, well, if they didn't, if the apple was from the tree of good and evil, and they hadn't yet eaten of it, then they didn't know good from evil, so they didn't know that it was wrong to eat the apple. And I raised that question also in the churches. And the apologists, who are people who have earned my contempt for the most part over the years,
Right.
because their main goal is not to engage with atheists. They will, from time to time, but their main goal is to reassure believers.
Yes.
So when I raised this question, they said, well, they didn't have to be perfect and they didn't have to know good and evil. They only had to know that this is what God instructed and they disobeyed. Well,
Yeah.
okay, but even so, to disobey God's instruction was clearly an imperfect choice. And that gets back to the same point that I raised. And this is what struck me from day one, was that if um, if they were ever going to act imperfectly, and yes, they were because they were not perfect beings, if they were ever going to do that, it was going to happen now when they had no experience
Yeah. The first
with dealing with
possible.
instructions.
Yes. Yes.
So
So
why then was such cosmic importance placed upon this disobedience?
yes. And this
Such
simple
that
act.
the entire future of humanity, according to Christian doctrine, the
Yeah,
entire
all
future of humanity was tainted by
all
that
of those
one
and
act.
all of those descendants,
Yes.
thousands and thousands of descendants. And the other query might be, why was such an act of uttermost importance, huge magnitude, attached to the eating of fruit?
That's an interesting question. And I thought about that, but that did not raise questions of self-contradiction in my mind. But it is certainly an interesting question. And I think that the answer, my answer, is that the way that the characters of Adam and Eve are portrayed and interpreted in Christian thought is that they were innocent, and to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they would no longer be innocent. Innocent doesn't mean, in this case, not guilty. It means inexperienced,
Naive
to the ways of the world, unworldly.
Yes.
Child.
But I feel a bit cheated here because, I'm one of their descendants, allegedly. And it doesn't seem to me to be such a criminal act to have eaten a piece of fruit. And I would rather them to have killed each other or done something genuinely wrong.
Well, yes, I mean, obviously, this is the equivalent of children caught with their hands in the cookie jar.
Yes.
And the punishment being expelled from paradise, from the Garden of Eden, paradisical garden, seems wildly inappropriate.
Hugely disproportionate.
Especially when you consider that God, in his omniscience, certainly would have known that the serpent was there.
Yes, he created it.
Why then did he not instruct Adam and Eve? Adding to his instruction about don't eat that fruit, he could have said, and by the way, kids, if you happen to encounter a talking serpent, don't pay any attention to what he says because he's trying to mislead you and harm you.
Yes. There's another thing that's contradictory too, isn't there? I mean, this creator deity is supposed to be benevolent.
Oh, yes.
So he hasn't shown much benevolence so far.
Oh, no, not at all. You can see before this happens with the tree, there is a hint of benevolence in the description in Genesis 1, in the description of how the garden was intended. He says, I have created the green plants, and they shall be your food. And he was envisioning a realm of peace. And that's nice.
It is. Yes, that's right. Yeah. There's all sorts of other questions about that, though. I mean, moving away a bit from the contradiction between sin and salvation that you're expounding on right now, there's how did he manage to create green plants before the sun?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, if you're looking for the strange details of the creation account, which you have night and day before the sun and the moon, it's
all of that.
You cannot take that stuff literally. It's just absurd. But it isn't necessary to. You see, I wasn't looking during my times in the churches. I wasn't looking for proof or evidence that yes, this is true. I just wanted to know if it could be true, or if it was intrinsically self-contradictory, and therefore false by the argumentum ad absurdum when an assertion leads inevitably, inescapably to a self-contradiction. Yes. You have to say, well, that assertion is false. It's just false.
Yes.
So there were problems with sin. There were enormous problems with just defining sin. I spoke with
Yes.
hundreds of Christians about what is the meaning of sin.
Yes.
And
What is
I
it?
boiled down their responses to 12 different definitions, distinct
Wow.
definitions, which I list in my book.
Do you? Oh,
Yes, I do.
can you give us a taste? Do you have two or three you could toss out as a
Oh, sure.
taste?
Sin is disobedience. Sin is separation from God. Um, sin is um, sin is treason against God. Uh,
Is it all against God, or is there any?
always.
So it doesn't include murder, or theft, or rape.
Well, those would be examples of sinful acts. But you see, Christian doctrine, or doctrinal Christianity, construes sin not just as wrong acts, but also as a state of being.
Oh, thought you were going to say thoughts, evil thoughts.
That too. Although that gets to be, I believe, a kind of a later development in Christian theology, which again, I do talk about it in my book. Augustine,
Yeah.
famous theologian, early theologian.
Because the theology has evolved over centuries, hasn't
Oh,
it?
absolutely, absolutely. And
Hell was
Augustine, talking about sin, described the stages in which a sinful act takes place. And, according to him, it begins with a thought, and it's followed by a more detailed thought that has to do with, okay, I was tempted to do this, and now the second stage is I'm making plans to do this, and the third stage is I do it. And
Yes.
Augustine's point was that sin is not limited to the third stage, I do it. Sin begins with I am planning to do it.
I see.
Thought.
Yes. Right.
Thought control. So anyway, these were the kinds of questions. There was a tremendous amount of self-contradiction and uncertainty. I can tell you that a major part of my book is devoted to spelling out the intrinsic self-contradictions in the doctrines of sin and in the doctrines relating to salvation.
Well, can I mention at this point that your book, the title is Doctrine Impossible.
Yes.
And it can be found by visiting your website, which is tickering along the bottom here now.
Yes, rationalityandfaith.com.
With hyphens between the words.
Yeah,
yes.
Because, and from at that website, people who are interested, you find a description of the book, excerpts, and a link to the current edition at the Amazon site.
Where they will be able to purchase.
Where they'll be able to, also at that site, they'll also be able to see the reviews that have been posted today.
Great. Is there an audio version? Have you got an audio version yet?
An audio? No.
That's a coming thing, People like to have books.
Yeah, they do.
Years.
Yeah, I have not done anything like that. I guess I'm waiting for Hollywood first to come and try to make a movie out of it. But,
well, good luck with that. Yes.
But no, seriously, the book was a great deal of work for me, even though I spent my career as a professional writer, and I generally write very quickly. This book was very, very difficult for me because I was trying to figure things out as I was writing. And that was not always easy, and I was accustomed to dealing with technical material, and I dealt with some pretty technical material as a medical writer, but Christian doctrine was a different story altogether. It was extraordinarily slippery, self-contradictory.
Yes. Yes.
And
technical writing tends to go sequentially, or there's a link that you can
Oh,
follow.
yes. Yeah, I mean,
But
it's very clear. There's evidence to support this. Here is why we believe this. Here are
yes,
the issues that remain
yes,
undefined or uncertain.
mhm,
And so it's relatively easy to deal with.
yeah,
Religious doctrine that's a different story altogether.
not like that. No, it's more of a mashup between history and attractive narrative. A
Yeah, and
storyline.
it gets into issues of philosophy and
Yes,
psychology,
yes.
all sorts of things. And one
I've
of the things that I do want to mention is now we talked earlier
mm,
about certainty, the desire for certainty, which I shared.
yes.
So let me just mention and finish that thought by saying that uh, eventually I realized that what I had thought was certainty among the churchgoers that I encountered, who, by the way, were by and large exceptionally nice people.
Yes, lovely people.
Yes.
Yes,
But what I thought was certainty was really dogmatism.
yes,
It was an unwillingness to um, subject cherished notions to rational scrutiny. It's just a
and
dogmatic insistence that it had to be so. It
yes,
couldn't
and
be questioned.
the trouble with dogmatism is it goes with intolerance.
It often does. And it's worth noting, since you bring that up, that doctrinal Christianity in particular, and I won't talk about other religions because I don't know as much about them, but doctrinal Christianity is the doctrinal part of Christianity is intolerant. It is intolerant because it classifies people as saved or damned
Yes,
according to where is your faith? Do you have faith? Do you have the right kind of faith?
yes, yes,
And anything else that may be relevant to someone's life, their accomplishments, what they've done that's good, that's bad, none of that has anything to do with salvation,
no,
at least as construed in
mm,
Protestant theology.
yes. It's
Um,
not a case of what good you might have done throughout your lifetime. It's a case of whether you've acquiesced and joined up and you're one of us.
yes, and whether you are subscribing to the right kind of faith,
Yes,
uh, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. Um,
it's hybrid-tribalism.
it is, and it's also another theme from my book is the idolatrous devotion to the Bible, and I use the word idolatrous
Yes, yes,
advisedly
yes,
because the Bible is a book; it's a tangible object,
yes,
and believers um, impute divine properties to
yes,
this
yes,
physical, tangible object, the divine
yes,
property of infallibility. That's
yes.
idolatry.
Which is
So
why,
when they read Paul's words, say in Ephesians, second chapter, 8 and 9, verses 8 and 9, that you are saved by faith alone and not by your works,
yes,
lest anyone brag about their works. It's just faith. When they read that, they have to give equal attention to Paul's words as they do to the words of Jesus, who said quite different things. For
yes,
example, at Matthew chapter 7, verse 20, where he said, by your works are you known.
yes, yes. I go with that. That's more like the way we think now.
Yes,
But you're right.
so as a result, and this was another thing that I realized more gradually over the course of the years that I attended churches, was that there is a profound disconnect between the teachings attributed to Jesus in the gospel accounts and the doctrines that define the Christian religion, which are derived mainly from the writings of Paul, not the writings, not the teachings of Jesus.
Yes, yes. And you're right. They have elevated the actual book, the Bible, the physical Bible itself, to an idol, which is why we have to put our hands on it and swear when we go to court.
Yes. And you know, for people who object, well, we don't worship the Bible. I know that. That's true. You don't bow down before the Bible and say, "Oh, Holy Bible, we worship thee." No, of course not. But primary faith is invested in the Bible, not in God. And I knew that from day one of my time in churches. How did I know that? Because every single belief about God was derived from, dependent on, and therefore secondary to what the Bible said. And it didn't matter how vile the depiction of God as a mass murderer, as an intolerant, vile tyrant, as someone guilty of serial acts of genocide and infanticide.
Yeah.
They would swear it's true because the Bible said so. So they will always say, God is this because the Bible says so. They will never say, God is not this, regardless of what the Bible says. And that shows where their primary faith is, not in God, in the Bible. And that is idolatry.
Bible, God.
Yes.
Bible, God.
Yeah, so they don't have to worship the Bible. The point is that they place primary faith in the Bible and not in God.
Right. So you've now mentioned faith a couple of times. And earlier on, I noticed that you started a sentence that included the word proof, but you quickly dropped that and skated on to evidence.
Yes. Well, because we very seldom have, definitive proof of things. We get by, for the most part, even in science, with the preponderance of evidence.
Yeah. And as a medical writer, you will know that. Now, I have as I'm a retired science teacher, I have a position on that too, which is that to get proof, you require absoluteness. If it's less than 100%, it's not proven because there's some element of doubt. So I say that we demand 100% substantiation to have proof, and you can only get that conceptually, is my position. So you can have it in geometry, which is entirely fabricated, and you can have it in one or two other fields. I can't think of any at the moment. But as soon as you're dealing with natural realm, the reality that's outside of your cranium, then in that place, proof is not available. The best you've got is evidence, which you get by observing. And that's where science lives, in the natural realm. And the tool of science is not proof, it's evidence from observations.
Yes, and I would add to, and this is a point of, to make a clear point, which you, John, will certainly understand. The term theory is very often used in a kind of a casual way to indicate a speculation. Well, we don't really know, it's just a theory. But in science, theory has a different meaning. A theory is a model or a construct to explain some phenomenon which is supported by all extant evidence and is not contradicted by any extant evidence. Does this make it proof? Well, in the sense that you just defined proof of absolute certainty, no, because it's possible that in the future we will find evidence that leads us to question what we now have as a theory. But at any given time, a theory represents the highest degree of certainty that we can have. Even if it isn't absolute proof, it is the degree of certainty, the highest degree of certainty that we can achieve, because all the evidence points to it. None of the evidence points away from it. That's the meaning of theory in science. So when creationists, for example, say that evolution is just a theory, they are misusing the term theory grossly, and they know it. They know they are misusing it, because this point has been made to them hundreds and hundreds of times.
Yes, but it doesn't serve their purpose, which is to spread their doctrine across.
And as long as we're on that, I'll just finish up by saying, why do creationists care one way or the other how life originated on Earth and proliferated and diversified? Right. Why do they care? Yeah. Because their faith is not in God, their faith is in the Bible and in a literal interpretation of the Bible. That's the reason why they are so vehemently opposed to evolution.
You've raised some very interesting points there. I'd like to add a little bit to your definition of theory. I'd like to say that you're right, it's the best explanation that we have today. Yes. But it makes predictions so that we can investigate it and test it. So that, for example, when Einstein came up with relativity, he had to wait for, I can never remember the guy's name, but there was a British astronomer who went to a telescope on an island in the Atlantic and observed starlight being bent round the sun.
Yes,
when there was an eclipse. Yeah. So I'll try and remember his name. So the theory has had all of the substantiation by observations, but there's still a future possible investigation that can be carried out. I agree. Religion seems to be, I don't know, a rag bag of stuff. It's got weird opinions about there being some sort of God who has properties of omniscience and benevolence and omnipotence and whatever the other one is. And then in this bag of stuff that is got the label religion on the front, there's also attitudes towards morality, particularly what we do with our gonads, and all sorts of other bits and pieces, like sin, which it turns out is not crime, it's just being bad towards God. So
sin, as I mentioned, has many definitions that Christians themselves say, no, this is what sin is. No, this is what sin is.
Yes.
And when I looked at all of those, trying to figure these things out, I realized that it all boils down to one coherent concept. Everything else makes no sense and is not tenable. And that is, sin is imperfection. That's all it means. That's the only coherent meaning it has, is imperfection. Because, as in Romans, Paul writes, all have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God. Yes, we are all imperfect.
Yes.
We are all imperfect.
Nobody would argue with that. We've all done silly things.
So that is the only meaning of sin.
But they want to
imperfection. But
they want to capture that, don't they? They want to own our silliness so that they can use it against us in order to control us by offering a absolution.
The history of the church is fairly dismal. The church that supposedly worships Jesus as God committed inconceivably bloody crimes against fellow Christians. Well, they were the wrong kind of Christians. They had the wrong doctrinal beliefs. And horrible crimes against non-Christians. What would Jesus have said to all of that?
Indeed. And he's not just Not just Christians, though, is it? I mean, take a look. I've just been doing for my news the latest reports on goings on in Afghanistan. And of course, the Taliban have taken over there, which are one
Yes.
particular breed of Muslims. And but there's been a couple of suicide bomb attempts at mosques, one in Kandahar and one in another city. And 100 and more people have been killed, including the bombers themselves, of course. But the reason they did it is because that mosque belonged to the wrong sort of Muslim.
Yes. Yeah. And this is what I mean when I say that doctrinal religion, the religion that says this is the right doctrine, this is the type of doctrine you must accept and adhere to.
Intolerant dogma.
Is intolerant. It is intrinsically intolerant. It is intrinsically dehumanizing because it pays no attention to human beings and what their lives are about, for good or bad. All it cares about is, do you have the right kind of belief? Are you shouting the right kind of doctrine?
In other words, are you agreeing or arguing with me?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
So dissent is not taken well. In fact, in liturgical terms and theological terms, dissent has its own special word: heresy.
Yeah. Well,
heresy is rejecting the essential dogma of the church.
They've had to invent
teachings that may not be questioned. Is heresy.
Who was it said, if you want to find out who controls you, find out who you can't criticize? That was one of your presidents, I think. Somebody famous said that. And so,
sure.
Absolutely. So this is all about tribalism and agreeing to submit to whichever leader of the tribe you've affiliated with. Right. Now, you also mentioned faith. So what do you think that is?
Now, this is a topic that invariably gets me into trouble with non-believers, fellow non-believers, because faith has, in my mind, has meaning that is not nearly as sinister as most atheists like to portray it, at least in my experience. I draw these distinctions. Concepts that are supported by evidence, that's knowledge. False beliefs that are contradicted by evidence, that's delusion.
Right. Yes,
but
I'm liking
what if
this.
there is no evidence at all on some idea? To believe something without evidence, it's not contradicted by evidence, not supported by it either. To place trust in an idea for which there is no evidence, that to me is what faith is all about.
Right.
And,
so you're taking it as...
I have faith in a certain idea.
Right.
An idea that I call spirituality.
This is interesting.
And there is no evidence for it. I cannot provide evidence for it any more than I can provide evidence against it. And yet, because there is no evidence, no more evidence for it than there is for religion, I should say. Because there's no evidence one way or the other, there's nothing for the rational mind to assess and say, well, this is consistent with the evidence. No, this is contradictory to the evidence. There is no evidence. So rationality plays no role in it. And I will not, therefore, criticize an idea held on faith by calling it irrational, which is the same term that I would use for a delusion, an idea that is contradicted by evidence. I will not use that term.
So you've thought this through, haven't you? So you're not in favor of faith being labeled as blind faith.
Yeah, well, it's in a sense it is blind faith, in that there is no evidence that I can look at. But I would say that I will not label it irrational.
I gotcha.
I would not. I would not. There are people who, non-believers, more militant,
Hmm.
who insist that faith is contrary to fact. No, sometimes religious faith is. There's no doubt about that. For example, creationism, especially young Earth creationism, that is
Yes.
most assuredly contrary to fact.
To
That's
fact.
delusion,
Yes.
and it's
I
based
see.
upon
Well,
untenable primary faith in the Bible as the inerrant word of God. And the notion that the Bible is inerrant, that
yes.
too is a delusion
Yes.
because the facts belie it. You can point to the fallibility of the Bible.
Yes.
And so
Well,
you cannot say it is infallible. But in general, although there are countless examples of faith-based beliefs that are clearly false in a factual kind of way. But that's not the essence of what faith itself is to me. To me, faith is trust in an idea that for which there is no supportive or refutative evidence.
well, you've made me think because you've obviously thought about the meanings of these words in a very philosophical way for a long time. And I have my attitude towards some of these words too, because coming from the point of view of a science teacher, I like to think in terms of three of these related words, which in ordinary conversation are tossed around as though they're synonymous, but they aren't. And one of these words is confidence. Right now,
Okay.
I think in my mind, confidence is empirical. You can measure it. It's got numbers attached to probabilities.
Oh, probabilities. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, yes,
so
I understand.
for example, we could say that we have a I don't know, a 98% confidence in the safety of flying by Airbus or whatever, whereas we only have a 92% confidence in the safety of riding on a motorcycle. You know,
Okay,
these are
so
measured
you're applying confidence in this sense to
statistical.
the specific measurable
Yeah,
likelihood of something happening.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
statistical.
yes,
Yeah,
and indeed, and in statistics, there's even, as you know, a concept called a confidence interval.
yeah, yes. So that's what I like. That's
Yes.
what I like to use confidence for.
Okay.
Something which you can attach a number to. Then there's trust, and you mentioned trust as well.
Yes.
And we all have trust in some of our individual relatives and family and friends. We have measures of trust about them. And I would say that although that's not measurable, you can't put a ruler on it and say there's so much trust in this person. It has a reputational construct to it because in the past they've always behaved in that sort of a way in this sort of a situation, so you trust that they will continue to be reliably acting in that sort of a way in future. And that's where I pitch trust. But then I put faith as having neither of those substantiations.
Uh-huh. Well, I think that that's certainly a legitimate perspective on these terms. Um, I would perhaps, taking off from that starting point, I would make the distinction between faith and belief.
Yes,
Uh,
yes,
I believe that there is life somewhere else in the universe because it
yes,
just doesn't seem likely that in such a vast universe
yes,
that there's no other intelligent life than what we have on Earth. However, I don't have trust in that notion. And the distinction for me between trust and belief is that trust means I am willing to incur some degree of risk on behalf
Yes.
of the idea.
Yes.
I believe that there's life elsewhere, but I'm not going to risk anything on it. It's just not that important to me.
Yes. Yes.
Paul Tillich, the famous theologian, philosopher, described trust as an ecstatic focus, faith as an ecstatic focus on issues of the highest importance. So, so the idea of importance is part of faith, and the idea of trust as merely more than just an intellectual, yeah, that sounds likely.
Yeah. Well, now,
so I draw that distinction.
Okay. Well, I'll come at you then with my version of belief, because like you, I think that belief is an overrated commodity. I think too much store is set by belief, because it can be quite trivial and very personal and subjective. I mean, I can say that I believe coffee tastes nicer without sugar in it, and that is the use of the word belief. But it doesn't have very much import, and the rest of the universe is unimpressed.
That's right. Also, of course, beliefs can be false.
Yes, indeed. Yes. So the way I like to think of belief is in a choice, like a bet. So, for example, you could say, I believe my horse is going to win this race. And your friend might say, no, I believe my horse is going to win this race. And you can hold these beliefs, and you can hold them strongly or weakly as you please. But after the race is run, then there's no person, there's no purpose, there's no role for believing or disbelieving anymore, because you now have the knowledge of which horse.
That's right. Knowledge has replaced belief.
Yes, yes. But now the interesting thing is that all of the philosophers I react with tell me that knowledge is a part of belief rather than the other way around. They want to make belief the top dog, and knowledge is sort of subsidiary and dependent upon whether it's a justified true belief. You know that JTB definition of knowledge. And I think that's the wrong way around. I want knowledge to be more firm and more relevant than belief, which is
but if I may, John, my instinct is that in saying that knowledge is a subset of belief, I think the import of that is not which is more important, which is more admirable, which is more reliable. Higher doesn't mean any of those things. It just means of a broader category. So in that case, a belief is a mental conviction that this is so.
Yes.
Knowledge is the subset of belief in which I'd say this is so, and here is the evidence for it.
Right. Right.
So I can see what your
So I check this out,
but I can also see how people would say that knowledge is a subset of belief. It is the subset of beliefs that are supported by evidence.
Yes. Yes. So I checked this out in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And one of the definitions, of course, it gives a lot of different definitions and analyzes them and gives all different eminent opinions about them. But one of the definitions which I alighted upon is that belief is an attitude towards a proposition. Nothing more, just that. So given that,
belief exists in our thoughts.
Yes.
So somebody says to me, gravity is a real phenomenon. If you hold an object up and let go of it, it will fall.
Mm.
And in my thoughts, I assess that claim.
Mm.
And I say, yes, I believe that.
Mm.
I have an attitude of acceptance toward
Mm.
that claim.
Mm.
On the other hand, somebody says, I have an object in my hand and I let go of it, and it turns into a flower and flies away and makes musical sounds. And I
Mm.
say, no, I don't think so. My
Yes.
attitude is one of disbelief in that case.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So,
So,
so I can go with that
yeah.
definition.
So taking on from where we've got, you are using knowledge as a belief which has evidence, a supported belief. I'm thinking that I would prefer knowledge to be the word that you use for supported beliefs, and
Mhm.
the word belief to be used for dubious things, a bit like
Okay,
degree.
so I understand. So you are preferring belief and knowledge to be separate categories rather than one as a subcategory of the other.
Yes, yes, yes. I
Yeah,
think the
well, I
Greek.
have no objection to that. I mean, I am not the vocabulary police. I have my own ways of defining
Yes,
certain terms.
yes, mm,
On the website, which I see is still scrolling across the
yeah,
screen,
yeah.
I have a number of blogs that I've written. One of which is about the term spirituality. And we don't have
Hmm.
time to get into that, but there is a word and a half
Oh,
that
indeed.
has a
Yes,
load of different meanings.
yes,
And
yes,
I have my own definition of it, but I'm not going to
yes.
say that everybody has to follow my definition. It's just how
No.
I use the term.
Well, we've all got to come to our own arrangements with these words. And we've only got a few minutes left. So another time, maybe we'll come back and talk about spirituality, because
Oh, I
you're right.
very much like that. I would very much welcome
It
that.
means so many different things to different people. But finishing off on belief, coming from my point of view of wanting to use it specifically for dubious propositions, I would like to define it. And like you, I don't expect anybody else to agree with me or take on my definition. But I would like to define belief as an opinion about the unknown.
Okay, the unknown meaning that
It hasn't
we
happened yet.
don't have the evidence.
Exactly. We don't have any evidence. Yes. So, finishing off that, I regard faith as belief on steroids.
Okay, I understand that. That's insightful, and I understand exactly what you're saying,
It's a
because in
muscular.
a sense you are agreeing with me that it has to
Yes.
do with an attitude,
Yes.
acceptance, or for that matter, rejection
Yes.
of the unknown, an idea, a claim, an assertion
Yes.
for which we don't have evidence.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it like belief. It's an opinion about the unknown, but just more muscular.
Yeah, or as Tillich said, it is not just a belief; it is trust, the willingness to incur some risk, the ecstatic nature of with which the belief is held
Yes.
is faith. Yeah,
We're
yeah, I
going to
understand.
overrun. We're going to overrun our hour. I hope you don't mind if I keep you a couple of minutes longer. But
Oh no,
I
that's fine.
want to finish. I want to finish this with a word that I discovered recently, which is igtheism. Have you met that?
Atheism, yes,
IG theism.
having to do with the acknowledgement that we cannot know anything
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
about
It's the
God.
yeah. The idea about it, behind it, is nobody. There's no agreement about what a creator deity might be like. Some people say his characteristics are this, and some people say his properties are that, and there's no consensus of opinion about the the appearance or the qualities or even the sizes and, the measurements or whatever of this proposed creator deity.
We're
And
even assuming that a deity is a creator.
Well, yes, indeed. And in that situation, with that absence of knowledge, we don't know what we're looking for. We can't even begin to decide whether to be an atheist or a theist.
Okay, now go straight from there back to the quest for certainty.
Oh, yes.
How can you possibly get certainty when, according to, as you've just described, we cannot know anything about it? And what do we end up with? The Bible. We don't have to worry about God. He's described in the book, in the Bible, or in the Quran, or in whatever book is held sacred.
Yes, whichever one.
This is why religion is idolatrous. It is idolatrously devoted to its sacred books.
I'd just like to say hi to Otangelo, who's an old sparring partner of mine. He's been on my show some months ago. I hope you're okay, Otangelo, and how's Brazil going? I know you've had a bad outbreak of COVID down there, but so I hope take care, look after yourself. And I'm going to have to say, thank you very much, Steve Tiger. You have been fantastic, the way I knew you would. Next week, my guest is ex-Christian Erin. I have a lady guest next week. I'm looking forward to talking to her and hearing her journey for an hour at the same time in the same place next week. So thank you very much for watching, past and future viewers. Don't forget to like, share, comment, set the notifications, all that nonsense. I don't ask you for any money. This is a free channel, like the title says, Free Thought Hour. And I'd like to see you next week. Thank you for watching. And Steve, thank you for being an excellent guest.
John, I appreciate the invitation to appear on your program. I had a wonderful time, and perhaps we can do this again. I would look forward to that.
Yeah, that would be good. Do you know what I'm going to do? I've forgotten to make you an outro. So I'm going to play an old outro, and it will go up the screen, and it won't be your name. Or the alternative would be for me to waste time making it now, and the program would get dribbling on. So I'm going to show the wrong outro.
Okay.
Please don't be offended. I'll swap it in future for the correct outro with your name.
Fair enough.
So don't read the top name. Read Steve Tiger. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, John.